Nicholas Esposito was the untouchable prince of the underworld, a man whose name was whispered like a death sentence, until the night Margaret Whitfield did the unthinkable. She looked into those cold, obsidian eyes and said, "No." She pushed him away in the freezing rain, treating his offer of protection like a curse. But that was a year ago. Now, standing in the gold-lit splendor of the Esposito Gala, Margaret isn't running. She is clinging to him, her heart pounding not with the terror that nearly broke her, but with a desperate, suffocating sense of possession. In that moment, the wall she built around her heart collapsed, because she finally realized the truth. Nicholas wasn't the danger she had been fleeing from all along. He was the addiction she couldn't live without. Before we go any further, this is Mafia Mystery Shadow, where the choices we make in the shadows determine our destiny. If you want to know how a woman's rejection turned into a billionaire's obsession, subscribe, turn on notifications, and settle in. Margaret Whitfield adjusted the straps of a gown that cost more than her last 6 months of rent, a dress she had secured only by selling the last of her mother's jewelry. She stepped into the ballroom, her gaze fixed on the man at the center of the room. Nicholas didn't even look up as she entered. He didn't need to. He was the Mafia prince now, officially crowned, and he didn't ask twice. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She didn't need to look at the screen to know what it said. Another final notice from the bank. Another threat from the debt collectors who had started showing up at her door the moment the Esposito shadow stopped protecting her. Her life had become a slow, nauseating unraveling, a year of freedom that felt more like a slow-motion execution. Margaret leaned against a cold marble pillar and closed her eyes, remembering the rain. For the first time in a year, she let herself whisper his name into the crowded room. Nicholas. The word came out rougher than she intended, a plea disguised as a memory. She had survived the isolation, the hunger, and the fear of the dark. She had inherited her family's pride, but clearly not the strength to survive the world without him. "What have I done?" she murmured under her breath. And then she felt it. Presence. The air around her grew heavy, charged with a familiar, dangerous electricity. Her eyes snapped open. He wasn't across the room anymore. He was standing right behind her, his breath ghosting against her ear. "You chose the rain, Margaret," he whispered, his voice like velvet over gravel. "Why are you looking for the sun now?" The sound didn't come from a stranger. It came from the man who had been her secret protector while she was busy calling him a monster. The sky over the city didn't just leak. It mourned. Thick, icy needles of rain lashed against the pavement, blurring the neon lights of the district into smears of garish red and blue. Margaret stood huddled under the shallow alcove of an abandoned storefront, her breath hitching in the frigid air. She wasn't alone. A sleek black sedan sat idling at the curb, its engine a low, predatory hum that vibrated in her very marrow. Nicholas Esposito stepped out, moving with a terrifying grace that the storm couldn't touch. He didn't carry an umbrella. The rain simply seemed to concede to him, slicking back his dark hair and darkening the expensive fabric of his overcoat. He looked like the prince of a world Margaret wanted no part of. A world built on blood and silent debts. "You're trembling, Margaret," Nicholas said, his voice cutting through the roar of the downpour with effortless precision. He stepped into her space, bringing with him the scent of cedarwood and something metallic like a sharpened blade. "This life doesn't suit you. The cold, the hiding, the constant looking over your shoulder. It's beneath you." He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near her cheek, though he didn't touch her. The restraint was more intimidating than a physical blow. "My father is stepping back. The city is becoming mine. Come with me tonight. One word from me, and your name becomes untouchable. No one will ever threaten your family's shop again. No one will even look at you without permission." It was the ultimate power fantasy, delivered with the practiced ease of a man who had never been told no. For a heartbeat, the temptation was a physical weight. She was tired of the struggle, tired of the fear. But then she looked at his eyes, obsidian voids that promised a safety that felt like a cage. To accept his protection was to disappear into his shadow forever. +1. Protection. Margaret spat the word out, her voice cracking but defiant. She pushed off from the wall, stepping fully into the drenching rain to put distance between them. Is that what you call it? You're not a savior, Nicholas. You're virus. Everything your family touches rots. You think because you have a crown coming you can own people. You can own me. Nicholas's expression didn't flicker, but the air around him seemed to drop several more degrees. I am offering you the only shield you have in this city. Don't let your pride be the end of you. I'd rather drown in this rain than breathe your air, Margaret screamed over a sudden clap of thunder. She shoved his reaching hand away, the contact feeling like a jolt of electricity she wanted to purge from her skin. Stay away from me. Stay away from my life. Your name isn't a blessing, Nicholas. It's a curse. She turned and ran into the darkness, her shoes splashing through the oily puddles. She didn't look back, but she could feel his gaze on her spine, a heavy, silent promise. Behind her, the Mafia prince stood motionless in the deluge, the no echoing in the empty street like a gunshot that had finally found its mark. The silence that followed Nicholas's departure was more deafening than the thunder had been. In the days following that night in the rain, Margaret waited for the other shoe to drop, for the black sedans to park outside her family's small tailor shop, or for the heavy-set men in sharp suits to deliver a final, threatening ultimatum. But nothing happened. Nicholas Esposito had vanished as if he were nothing more than a fever dream spawned by the storm. Margaret walked with a lighter step at first, convinced she had won a battle for her very soul. She told herself that the sudden quiet was the sound of freedom. However, the safe life she had fought to reclaim began to fracture with a chilling, surgical precision. It started with the small things. The local produce vendor who had always extended her credit suddenly demanding upfront payment, his eyes skittering away from hers in shame. Then came the phone calls from the bank, their voices devoid of the professional courtesy they had shown her for years. By the end of the first week, the shop's most loyal clients, the wealthy socialites who had once praised her mother's needlework, cancelled their commissions without explanation. The neighborhood, which had always felt like a protective cocoon, now felt like a predatory hunting ground. The local street toughs, who used to clear a path when they saw her coming, now lingered outside her door, their whistles sharp and their gazes lingering too long on the brass lock of her front door. Margaret sat in the dim light of the back room, the rhythmic click of her sewing machine sounding like a countdown. She realized with a cold, hollow dread that Nicholas hadn't been the one threatening her. His mere existence had been the barrier between her and the wolves of the city. By rejecting him, she hadn't just pushed away a man. She had inadvertently signaled to every predator in the district that the Whitfields were no longer under the protection of the Esposito crown. She looked at her hands, still steady but pale under the flickering bulb. She had wanted to be free of the curse of his name, yet every closed door and every sneering glance reminded her that in this city, a no to the Mafia prince carried a price far higher than any debt. Her independence, once her greatest pride, was beginning to feel like a death sentence. The withdrawal of his shadow hadn't brought the light. It had simply left her standing entirely alone in the dark. The pressure didn't arrive with a scream. It arrived with a heavy, rhythmic thud of a fist against the shop's reinforced oak door. Margaret flinched, the silk fabric she was pinning slipping from her numb fingers. It was barely 8 in the morning, yet the air in the room felt thick with a new, suffocating hostility. When she opened the door, it wasn't the usual postman or a morning customer. It was Mr. Henderson, the landlord who had always been a man of quiet patience, until now. He didn't step inside. He stood on the threshold, his face a mask of sweating, nervous aggression. Behind him, 2 men Margaret didn't recognize leaned against a rusted sedan, their eyes hidden behind dark lenses, watching her with the detached hunger of vultures. I need the full arrears, Margaret. Today, Henderson barked, his voice cracking with a fear he was trying to turn into rage. Mr. Henderson, we had an agreement, Margaret began, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. I've never missed a payment in 5 years. You said the extension was fine. The extension is gone, he snapped, glancing over his shoulder at the men by the car. The rules have changed. The neighborhood isn't what it was. Have cost, have risk. If the money isn't in my hand by sundown, I'm changing the locks. I don't care about the fabric or the machines. It all goes to the curb. He turned and practically ran back to his vehicle, leaving the door swinging in the wind. Margaret leaned against the frame, the cold morning air biting through her thin sweater. It wasn't just the landlord. By midday, a man from the utility company arrived to inspect the meter. His tone sharp and accusatory, leaving her with a yellow slip that threatened immediate disconnection. Even the local creditors, men who had known her father for decades, sent messages that were no longer requests, but demands, veiled in the language of unforeseen liabilities. The realization hit her like a physical blow, colder than the rain she had stood in a week ago. Nicholas hadn't touched any of these people. He hadn't sent a single order to ruin her. He had simply stepped back. She walked to the window and looked out at the street. For years, she had believed she was standing on her own 2 feet, proud of her independence from the Esposito curse. But now she saw the truth. The city was a sea of sharks, and for a year, Nicholas had been the silent cage that kept them at bay. Without the shadow of the Mafia prince looming behind her, she wasn't a businesswoman. She was just prey. The no she had shouted in the rain hadn't just rejected a man. It had shattered her only shield, and for the first time in her life, Margaret Whitfield was truly, terrifyingly alone. The news didn't arrive via a formal announcement. It bled into the streets like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Margaret sat in the back of her cold shop, the power having been cut an hour ago, staring at the flickering screen of a battery-operated radio. Every station carried the same heavy weight. The coronation was over. Nicholas Esposito was no longer just the heir. He had been officially crowned the Mafia prince, the sole sovereign of the city's shadows. The commentators spoke in hushed, hurried tones about the new era of the Esposito syndicate. There were rumors of a purge, of old lieutenants who had dared to question his ascension being found silent in the early morning fog of the docks. The city was paralyzed, caught between fear and a grim sort of awe. Nicholas hadn't just taken his father's seat. He had reshaped it into a throne of glass and iron. Stories of his ruthlessness began to circulate like urban legends. A rival's warehouse burned to the ground with surgical precision, a crooked politician resigning in a fit of inexplicable terror, and a complete silencing of the street gangs that had once made the nights loud with violence. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lack of heating. The man she had rejected in the rain, the man who had looked at her with a lingering, dark warmth, was gone. In his place was a figure of clinical, terrifying efficiency. He was everywhere and nowhere. His face stared back at her from the front page of the morning papers, looking sharp and lethal in a tuxedo that cost more than her family's entire legacy. There was no trace of the man who had offered her a shield. His eyes were now obsidian mirrors, reflecting nothing but the absolute power he wielded. The neighborhood changed overnight. The aggressive creditors who had been pounding on her door just days ago were suddenly quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of people holding their breath, waiting to see who the new prince would strike next. Even the air in the district felt different, heavier, charged with an electric tension that made everyone walk a little faster. Margaret looked at the empty space on her workbench where a luxury commission should have been. She had wanted to be free of him, but as the news of his cold, calculated rise filled every corner of her world, she realized that Nicholas hadn't just become a boss. He had become the atmosphere of the city itself. She had said no to a man, but now she was forced to live in the kingdom of a god who didn't recognize her name anymore. The damp walls of the tailor shop seemed to close in on Margaret as she stared at the final eviction notice taped to the glass. It was a cold, clinical death warrant for her family's legacy. The power had been dead for days, leaving the air inside thick with a smell of stagnant dust and unfulfilled promises. Outside, the neighborhood she once called home had transformed into a gauntlet of hungry eyes. Without the invisible shield of the Esposito name, even the walk to the grocery store felt like a desperate gamble against the local gangs who now saw her as nothing more than unprotected prey. She sat at her mother's old cutting table, her fingers tracing the jagged wood. Her pride, once so fierce in the rain, was now a heavy, hollow weight. She had fought for a year to be free, only to find that freedom in this city was just a slower way to starve. As she began to clear the table to pack the few belongings she had left, her hand brushed against a heavy, cream-colored envelope wedged into the back of a drawer. It was an invitation, embossed with the gold leaf crest of the Esposito family. She remembered finding it months ago, likely sent by a rogue clerk or an old contact who hadn't yet heard of her fall from grace. It was an invite to the winter gala, the very night Nicholas was to be celebrated as the undisputed prince of the city. At the time, she had nearly burned it in a fit of righteous anger. Now it felt like a lifeline thrown from a sinking ship. Margaret held the card to the dim light filtering through the grime of the window. She was never meant to attend this event. Her name had undoubtedly been scrubbed from every official list the moment she walked away in the rain. To show up now was more than a social risk. It was a suicide mission. If she were caught, she would be at the mercy of a man who had spent the last year proving he had none left. But as a heavy thud sounded against the shop door, a warning from the landlord's enforcers that her time was up, Margaret's hand tightened on the gold-edged paper. She looked at the luxury silk bolt she had been saving, a deep, shimmering charcoal that matched the darkness of the city. She wouldn't go to beg, and she wouldn't go to apologize. If she was going to lose everything, she would do it in the light of the gold-lit halls she had once despised. She would walk into the lion's den not as a victim, but as the only woman who had ever dared to tell the prince no. It was her last resort, a desperate move in a game she was already losing, but as she picked up her shears, her heart pounded with a terrifying, addictive rhythm. She wasn't just going to the gala, she was going back to him. The charcoal silk moved against Margaret's skin like a living shadow as she stepped out of the rusted taxi and into the blinding radiance of the Esposito estate. The transition was violent. She had spent the last year in the dim, flickering light of a failing tailor shop, and now, the sheer scale of the gold-lit grandeur before her felt like a physical assault. The air here didn't smell of stagnant dust or rain. It smelled of expensive champagne, rare lilies, and the heavy metallic scent of absolute power. As she ascended the marble steps, the sensory shock was paralyzing. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the vaulted ceilings, casting 1,000 fractured diamonds across the polished floors. But it wasn't just the wealth that suffocated her. It was the atmosphere. The ballroom was packed with the city's elite, senators, billionaires, and titans of industry. Yet they all moved with a strange, subdued caution. There was no loud laughter, only the hushed murmur of voices that sounded like prayers whispered in a cathedral. The fear Nicholas commanded was a tangible thing, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the soles of Margaret's feet. She watched as waiters moved with trembling hands, and guests instinctively parted like a receding tide whenever a member of the Esposito inner circle passed. This was the gold cage she had once mocked, but standing inside it, she realized it wasn't just a prison for Nicholas. It was a fortress that kept the rest of the world in a state of perpetual submission. Margaret clutched her clutch bag until her knuckles turned white, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every pair of eyes that landed on her felt like a threat. She was an interloper, a ghost from a past Nicholas had supposedly buried. She expected the security detail to seize her at any moment, to drag her back into the darkness where she belonged. Yet, as she reached the edge of the ballroom floor, the crowd ahead of her suddenly fell silent. The parting was slow at first, then absolute. At the far end of the hall, framed by a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the kingdom he now owned, stood Nicholas. He was speaking to a group of men who looked ready to collapse under the weight of his gaze. He looked colder than the rain, sharper than the shears she had used to cut her dress, and more beautiful than any nightmare she had ever endured. Margaret realized then that she hadn't just entered a gala, she had entered his gravity. The addiction she had felt in the rain wasn't a memory. It was a trap, and as Nicholas slowly turned his head toward the entrance, Margaret knew the cage door had just slammed shut. The air in the ballroom seemed to thicken, turning into a heavy, suffocating syrup as Nicholas's gaze finally locked onto hers. Margaret stood frozen, her charcoal silk dress feeling like a second skin that was suddenly too tight. She had spent a year imagining this moment, sometimes with anger, sometimes with a hollow longing, but she had never expected this. There was no flicker of recognition in his eyes, no flash of the dark warmth that had once promised to burn her down. Instead, his obsidian eyes were like polar ice, reflecting her presence with a terrifying, clinical detachment. Nicholas didn't move toward her. He didn't offer a welcoming smile or even a nod of acknowledgement. He simply looked at her for a heartbeat longer than he would a stranger, then turned back to the circle of men surrounding him, continuing his conversation as if she were nothing more than a ghost haunting the periphery of his kingdom. The rejection was more violent than a physical shove. It stripped her of her history, her defiance, and her name. Margaret's face burned, a deep, humiliated heat rising from her chest. She realized then the true nature of his power. Nicholas didn't need to threaten her. He simply needed to ignore her. He had said he wouldn't ask twice, and he was a man of his word. The bridge she had burned in the rain was gone, and he wasn't going to rebuild it. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to save the legacy he had once offered to shield, the burden of the first move was entirely on her. She watched him from across the expanse of polished marble, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. He was the son of this golden cage, and every person in the room was orbiting his gravity. To approach him now, in front of the titans of industry and the lethal lieutenants of his inner circle, was to surrender her pride on a public altar. It was a walk toward a guillotine she had sharpened herself. Taking a trembling breath, Margaret forced her leaden feet to move. Each step felt like an eternity, the rhythmic click of her heels sounding like a countdown to her own destruction. She passed through the parting crowd, feeling their curious, judgmental stares like needles against her skin. Nicholas continued to speak, his voice calm and melodic, ignoring her approach until she was standing barely 3 feet away. Even then, he didn't look up. He waited, the silence stretching until it became an unbearable weight. He was forcing her to speak, to break the seal of the year-long silence she had initiated. Margaret swallowed the lump of pride in her throat, her voice a mere whisper that struggled to find its wings in the vast, gold-lit hall. "Nicholas," she breathed. He paused, the glass in his hand steady as a mountain. Slowly, with agonizing deliberation, he turned his head. His gaze swept over her, not as a lover, but as a sovereign assessing a beggar. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any emotion Margaret could recognize. "Do I know you?" The question cut through Margaret like a jagged shard of glass. "Do I know you?" The words were delivered with such terrifying indifference that for a moment, the golden ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis. The men surrounding Nicholas let out a collective low chuckle, a sound of predators mocking a wounded bird. Margaret felt the heat of 1,000 stares pressing into her skin, each one a needle of ridicule. Her pride, the very thing that had sustained her through a year of hunger and cold, was being dismantled in front of the city's elite. Nicholas didn't wait for her answer. With a graceful, dismissive turn of his shoulder, he signaled for the orchestra to transition into a slow, haunting waltz. He stepped away from the circle of sycophants, but he didn't move toward Margaret. Instead, he stopped before a woman standing near the arched balcony, a rival heiress from the Moretti family, draped in diamonds that caught the light like frozen tears. She was everything Margaret currently wasn't, secure, protected, and radiant with the confidence of someone who had never known the rain. Margaret watched, her breath trapped in her throat, as Nicholas placed a hand on the woman's waist. He led her onto the marble dance floor with a predatory elegance that made the room go silent. As they moved, the heiress leaned in close, whispering something against his ear that made the corner of Nicholas's mouth twitch into a ghost of a smile he hadn't given Margaret even in the days when he'd wanted her. A sudden, violent spike of heat flared in Margaret's chest. It wasn't the fear she was used to, nor was it the righteous anger she had nurtured for a year. It was something far more primitive and far more dangerous. It was a burning, jagged jealousy that made her vision blur at the edges. Seeing his hand on another woman's back felt like a betrayal of a bond she had claimed to hate. She had spent 12 months trying to convince herself that she wanted to be free of him, but watching him belong to someone else was an agony she hadn't prepared for. She realized then that Nicholas wasn't just ignoring her to punish her. He was showing her exactly what she had thrown away. He was giving his light to a rival, leaving Margaret to rot in the shadows she had insisted were her home. The Moretti girl laughed, a light, tinkling sound that echoed through the hall, and Margaret's fingers curled into her palms until her nails drew blood. The addiction she had denied was now a fever. She didn't just need his protection. She needed the man who had stood in the rain for her. But as the music swelled and Nicholas spun the heiress away, Margaret stood alone on the edge of the floor, realizing that the price of her pride might be watching the only man she had ever truly seen walk into the arms of her enemy. The jealousy was a poison, sharp and efficient, coursing through Margaret's veins until she could no longer stand the sight of Nicholas's hand on the Moretti girl's waist. As the music swelled, Margaret slipped through the crowd, her movement desperate and frantic, until she reached the heavy mahogany double doors of the West Wing. She didn't think. She only felt the pull of the man who had become her entire horizon. She bypassed the guards with a look of such hollow, icy authority that they hesitated just long enough for her to slip into the inner sanctum. The private office was a stark contrast to the gala's gold-lit chaos. It was a tomb of glass and dark leather, smelling of expensive bourbon and the same cedarwood scent that had haunted her dreams for a year. Margaret stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving, the charcoal silk of her dress rustling in the sudden silence. Moments later, the door clicked shut behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew the weight of his presence before he even spoke. "The inner chamber is for guests, Margaret," Nicholas said. His voice a low, dangerous velvet. "And we've already established that I don't know who you are." "Stop it," she whispered, finally turning to face him. He had discarded his jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, looking more like the man in the rain than the prince on the throne. "You know exactly who I am. You've been paying my debts. You've been keeping the wolves away while I was busy pretending I didn't need you." Nicholas walked toward her, his pace slow and predatory, until he pinned her between his heat and the edge of his massive desk. He didn't touch her, but the air between them felt like a live wire. "Is that why you're here? For a thank you?" He leaned down, his obsidian eyes searching hers with a cruelty that felt like a caress. "I didn't pay those debts because I wanted you back. I paid them because I don't like other men touching what I once claimed." "Then why let me suffer at all?" Margaret cried, her pride finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Why let me stand in the dark for a year?" Nicholas's jaw tightened, the only sign of the fire beneath the ice. "I told you that night that I wouldn't ask twice. The door to this life, to this room, and to me. It was never locked, Margaret. You were never a prisoner." He reached out then, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a touch so light it made her ache. "But you didn't want the gold. You didn't want the warmth. You chose the rain, the cold, and the pride. You walked out into the storm, and you expect me to apologize because you got wet." The truth was a physical blow. He hadn't abandoned her. He had simply given her exactly what she asked for. Margaret looked up at him, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a terrifying, absolute possession. She realized then that the no she had uttered a year ago was a lie she could no longer tell. She didn't want the rain anymore. She wanted the monster. "I'm here now," she breathed, her hand reaching up to grip his forearm. "You are," Nicholas whispered, his eyes darkening until they were endless. "But the price of entry has gone up." Nicholas's hand stayed on her jaw, a heavy, tethering weight that made it impossible to look away from the cold fire in his eyes. He didn't push her away, nor did he pull her closer. He simply held her in that agonizing middle ground where the truth usually lived. "The price has gone up, Margaret," he repeated, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum beneath her skin. "I don't want your gratitude. I don't want your apologies. I want the version of you that realized freedom was just another name for being forgotten." He moved his hand not to let her go, but to slide a heavy leather-bound ledger across the polished mahogany surface of the desk. The cover was worn, the edges frayed as if it had been opened and closed 1,000 times in the dark. With a trembling hand, Margaret reached out and flipped it open. What she saw made the breath die in her throat. It wasn't a ledger of criminal enterprises or blood money. It was a record of her own life. Column after column was filled with her name, her debts, and the dates of her most desperate moments. There was the rent for the tailor shop, marked as settled through a third-party holding company. There were the utility bills she thought had been delayed by a clerical error, actually paid in full by an anonymous account. Even the local thugs who had suddenly stopped harassing her were noted, dates and times where security intervention had been authorized. Nicholas hadn't just been a distant observer. He had been the architect of her survival. For 12 months, while she was cursing his name and celebrating her independence, he had been the ghost in her machine, pulling the strings of the city to ensure the wolves didn't tear her apart. He had allowed her to feel the chill of the world just enough to understand it, but he had never let the frost reach her heart. Margaret's eyes blurred as she stared at a final entry from 3 days ago, the purchase of her family's debt from the Moretti Bank. He hadn't just shielded her. He had bought her entire world. "You never let me go," she whispered, the paper crinkling beneath her fingertips. "You kept me on a leash made of gold and paper." "I told you once, Margaret," Nicholas said, stepping behind her so his shadow swallowed her whole. "I don't let anything I love walk into the rain without an umbrella, even if that person is too proud to hold it themselves." The weight of the ledger felt like the weight of her own soul. Every no she had ever said to him was written over by his silent yes. She wasn't just his obsession. She was his project, his ward, his addiction. And as she looked at the meticulously kept records of his devotion, the last of her defiance dissolved into the dark, intoxicating realization that she was finally home. She didn't want to be free anymore. She wanted to be his. The heavy silence of the office was shattered not by a word, but by the sudden violent vibration of the double doors. Before Nicholas could move his hand from Margaret's jaw, the air in the sanctum shifted from intoxicating tension to cold, survivalist instinct. The doors didn't open, they were breached. 3 men in tactical gray, not the black of the Esposito guard, burst into the room. They didn't aim for the prince. They knew that to kill Nicholas Esposito was to invite a war that would burn the city to its foundations. Instead, they aimed for the only thing in the room that lacked a suit of armor: Margaret. "Don't move, Prince," the lead man barked, his voice distorted by a mask. He leveled a silenced pistol at Margaret's chest. "We don't want your throne. We just want the leverage you've been spending so much money to hide." The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. The secret ledger she had just closed was her death warrant. By protecting her from the shadows for a year, Nicholas hadn't just kept her safe. He had inadvertently turned her into his greatest weakness. To his rivals, she wasn't a woman who had said no. She was the one thing the Mafia prince couldn't bear to lose. Nicholas didn't flinch. His body remained a statue of lethal calm, but his eyes transitioned into something Margaret had never seen, a void so dark it seemed to swallow the light of the room. He didn't step away from her. Instead, he slid his hand from her jaw to the back of her neck, pulling her body flush against his, using his own frame as a human shield. "You've made a mistake," Nicholas said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic growl that vibrated against Margaret's spine. "You think she's my weakness. You think because I kept her in the dark, I'm not prepared to burn the world to keep her there. Give us the Moretti codes and she lives," the gunman countered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Margaret felt the cold press of Nicholas's signet ring against her skin. Her heart was no longer pounding with the fear of the rain. It was pounding with the raw, jagged adrenaline of the addiction. She looked at the gunman, then up at Nicholas's profile. In the gold-lit splendor of the office, surrounded by men who wanted her dead, she realized the ultimate truth. The danger wasn't outside. The danger was the man holding her, and for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be anywhere else. "The Moretti codes are written in blood," Nicholas whispered, his gaze never leaving the intruders. "And tonight I think I'll add yours to the ink." Before the gunman could blink, Nicholas's hand moved toward the underside of the mahogany desk, and the room exploded into a symphony of shattering glass and calculated violence. The ambush had begun, and Margaret was no longer just a girl in a silk dress. She was the prize at the center of a storm that was about to consume them all. The office erupted into a blur of motion and steel. Nicholas's hand moved with a speed that defied the eye, pulling a weapon from beneath the desk as he shoved Margaret toward the floor. "Stay down," he roared, his voice a thunderous command that vibrated through the very foundations of the room. But as the first exchange of gunfire shattered the glass shelves behind them, Margaret didn't crawl toward the safety of the heavy mahogany furniture. She looked at the men in tactical gray, then at the man who had spent a year as her silent, secret anchor. If she ran now, if she hid in the shadows like she had for the last 12 months, she would always be the victim of the storm. She would always be the girl in the rain, waiting for someone else to hold the umbrella. In a moment of clarity that burned hotter than the muzzle flashes, Margaret made her choice. She didn't seek the exit. Instead, she surged upward, her silk dress rustling like a battle flag, and grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from the side table. As one of the gunmen rounded the desk to flank Nicholas, Margaret didn't scream. She swung with every ounce of the resentment and the newly discovered passion that had been building inside her. The crystal shattered against the man's temple, a spray of amber liquid and glass exploding into the air. He collapsed in a heap of stunned limbs. Nicholas pivoted, his gaze snapping to her with a look of raw, unadulterated shock. For a heartbeat, the Mafia prince looked human, his obsidian eyes wide with the realization that the woman he had tried to protect was now protecting him. "I'm not leaving," Margaret shouted over the chaos, her voice steady and sharp. "You said I chose the rain, Nicholas. Well, I'm choosing this instead." She didn't wait for his approval. She moved into his space, her body acting as a second set of eyes, alerting him to the movement by the shattered window. Nicholas let out a low, dark laugh, a sound of pure, terrifying triumph. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers tangling in her hair for a split second, pulling her briefly against the heat of his chest before he turned back to the remaining intruders. There was no more hesitation. They moved as a single lethal unit. Margaret wasn't a liability to be guarded. She was a partner in the violence. By choosing to stand by his side during the confrontation, she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She was no longer just Margaret Whitfield, the girl who said no. She was the woman who had looked into the abyss of the Esposito world and decided it was the only place she ever wanted to be. The gold-lit splendor was gone, replaced by the smoke and iron of a war she was finally ready to win. The smoke from the exchange hung in the air like a heavy velvet shroud, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted into something far more intoxicating than gunpowder. Nicholas stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his eyes never leaving the doorway where the last of the intruders had fled into the night. He didn't look like a man who had just survived an assassination attempt. He looked like a god who had just reclaimed his altar. Margaret stood beside him, her charcoal silk dress torn at the hem and stained with the amber ruins of the decanter, but she had never felt more alive. She waited for the familiar cold wash of terror to return, the shaking hands, the bile in her throat, the desperate urge to run back into the rain. But it never came. Instead, a low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through her veins, a heat that started in her fingertips and settled deep in her marrow. She looked at her hands. They weren't trembling. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but the rhythm was different now. It wasn't the frantic, stuttering beat of a cornered animal. It was the heavy, predatory strike of a drum. She looked at Nicholas, at the blood on his knuckle and the lethal set of his jaw, and she realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that she didn't want to be safe. She didn't want the quiet, gray life of the tailor shop where she was always one missed payment away from nothingness. She wanted this. She wanted the shadow that swallowed the world. She wanted the man who had spent a year manipulating the very air she breathed just to ensure she stayed within his reach. You're looking at me differently, Nicholas said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register that always made her skin prickle. He turned toward her, his gaze sweeping over her disheveled state with a look of terrifying hunger. The fear is gone. What took its place, Margaret? She didn't answer with words. She stepped into his space, her heels crunching on the shattered crystal, until she was close enough to feel the radiating heat of his body. She reached up and placed her palm directly over his heart, feeling it beat in perfect, heavy synchronization with her own. It's not fear, she whispered, her voice like silk over stone. It's possession. She realized then that the addiction wasn't just to his protection or his wealth. It was the thrill of belonging to the prince, of being the only person in the city who could stand in the middle of his storm and not be blown away. She wasn't his ward or his secret project anymore. She was his claim. And as Nicholas's hand tangled in her hair, pulling her head back to expose the line of her throat, Margaret leaned into the darkness. She had spent a year fighting to be free, only to realize that the most beautiful cage in the world was the one where he held the key. The girl in the rain was dead, and in her place stood a woman who had finally learned that the only thing better than being untouchable was being his. The silence that reclaimed the office was heavier than the gunfire had been, thick with the scent of ozone and the realization that their lives had irrevocably fused. Nicholas stood amidst the ruins of his sanctuary, the shattered glass reflecting the gold lights of the gala like 1,000 fallen stars. He looked down at Margaret, his hand still anchored in her hair, waiting for the inevitable retreat, for the moment she would realize the cost of the blood on the floor and run back into the night. But Margaret didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her fingers curling into the fine silk of his shirt, anchoring herself to the center of the chaos. She looked up at the man she had called a curse, her eyes bright with a dark, newfound clarity. The woman who had pushed him away in the rain was a stranger to her now, a ghost of a girl who didn't understand that true freedom was a lie. You think you can just walk away now? She whispered, her voice steady and laced with a terrifying sweetness. You think you can protect me from the shadows for a year and then leave me to face this world without you? Nicholas's grip tightened, his thumb tracing the pulse point at her neck. I told you the price had gone up, Margaret. This isn't a game you can quit when the lights go out. I don't want to quit, she countered, stepping even closer until there wasn't a breath of air between them. The adrenaline was a fever in her blood, an intoxicating heat that made the safety of her old life seem like a shallow grave. I'm not letting you go, Nicholas. Not after this. Not ever. You've made me a part of your world, and now you're stuck with the monster you created. A slow, predatory smile spread across Nicholas's face, a look of pure, dark satisfaction. It wasn't the smile of a lover, but the smile of a man who had won a long, patient war of attrition. He didn't look surprised. He looked vindicated. He had known the moment she stepped into the rain a year ago that she was exactly like him. She just hadn't been hungry enough to admit it yet. I knew you'd come to love the taste of the danger, he murmured, his lips brushing against hers. It's the only thing that makes the gold worth having, isn't it? He pulled her into a kiss that tasted of iron and salt, a seal on a contract that could never be broken. Margaret closed her eyes, finally surrendering to the addiction. She had once called his name a curse, but as she clung to the Mafia prince in the wreckage of his empire, she realized she was wrong. The curse wasn't Nicholas. The curse was the realization that she could never breathe without the smoke of his world filling her lungs. She had said no in the rain, but in the gold-lit splendor of her own surrender, she finally said yes to the dark.